Do you want to know what the funniest thing about this chapter was for me? Is that as much as it kind of gives you a little bit more for Hakari and his power and what he's going to potentially add to the story, I actually found the overall information that is given a lot more valuable and kind of eclipses everything else. Don't get me wrong, I love the explanation that Hakari gives, even though it's very within his own realm, which for some can be very convoluted, but because it's very junctional, it hinges, it takes a lot of turns, but each turn is visualized and conceptualized rather well, so you get a very clear picture, but that picture is kind of just very scraggly and all over the place. Does that make sense? Like I said, for a lot, it may seem very overwhelming. What does he mean when he talks about fever? What does he mean when he talks about the revision that's coming in place and trying to push the Jujutsu headquarters further when he was shunted away from it? What is he really trying to gain or do? Not only does he give you an insight for Hakari's personality, his emotions, and kind of his mental state with the whole scenario. He's very intelligent in some ways, but also blindsided by narcissism. But it's not in the most aggressive type of ways, like Naoya, for example, who's just narcissistic on top of being egotistical, on top of being someone that just does not care about anyone else other than himself. Whereas Hakari is definitely less within that realm of Naoya, but still kind of methodical in his approach of dealing with his own personal issues first. But it does seem like he cares, or at least wants to care, about people that are in similar positions to himself. So instead of just uplifting himself and only himself, he kind of takes everyone that moves along with him, which obviously includes Kira. The weird thing about it, at least from my perspective, is that as much as he was pushed and completely shied away from the Jujutsu sorcery world and the higher-ups with how they think about Hakari, he's still willing to kind of conform to their beliefs as long as he gets his own way, which is odd to me. For someone that we have seen very little of, but is very within his own way, wants his own thing to kind of come true and is able to make it come true, not only with his power but his mindset, why would he want to even try and conform to the idea of revising some sort of fight club to push it to the higher ups to make it accepted so it's more legal? Does he want the legality of it? Does he want the comfortability of something that he can have through and through? Or does he want the kind of ego boost of putting himself in a position and overpowering or overtowering the opposition with whatever information he brings across and what he's able to get away with? Do you see how convoluted that all sounds? In reality, it's not that difficult. More so, Hakari thinks about one thing which kind of contradicts what he was doing to begin with, or why he's doing it to begin with, only for it to kind of transpire into something else. Does that make sense? The higher ups are having this revision of the regulations because we find out that they're very conservative, which genuinely isn't surprising. I briefly mentioned that idea within the previous video in regards to Kira, and I feel like Kira potentially going down that route of their identity and what they feel more comfortable with is something that the higher ups do not necessarily mess with or appreciate because they're very conservative, they're very stuck in their ways. So not only do they have this kind of ideal Jujutsu sorcerer in their mind, not only for their abilities and their strengths and their weaknesses, but also their emotions, their mental state, who they are as a person, as an individual. So for someone like Kira, that obviously draws the shortest of sticks and gets completely disrespected and belittled because of that, which makes for a very interesting story. Like, if that is something that Akatami wants to play on, I would be more than happy to spend a whole 2 to 3 chapters just focusing on, because not only does it completely demonize, villainize, and push the Jujutsu higher-ups in a even worse direction, making them seem like big bad people, because they already are. We have no reason to like them whatsoever, just with how they've handled Yuji and Gojo and borderline every single character within the story. But now you see kind of the more heavy-hearted political and belief side of things being puppeteered. So Kira and Hakari don't fall within their beliefs, don't fall within their perfect image of a Jujutsu sorcerer. Kick them out, get rid of them entirely. If Akatami wanted to play on that with Kira, I'd obviously more than love it. I feel like that's an incredible clever way to do it, even though Kira isn't centered to be the main spotlight of this miniature arc. It's more so Hakari, but you can fold Hakari in there with Kira. Someone like Hakari seems very personal, very individualistic on his own type beat, but when you take in Kira, who has been kicked out alongside of him, I wouldn't be surprised if Hakari too felt some type of way about it. He too felt disappointed that the higher-ups put someone like Kira out onto the streets, away from sorcery, away from the Jujutsu high and the comfortability of it, just because of their personality, just because of their gender potentially, just because of who they are as a person and what they uphold, just because they may not conform to these very outdated and conservative beliefs that the higher-ups pertain to. Surprisingly, about 80% of this information that I've just talked about is given to you within this chapter. Not more so on the Kira front, but more so on the higher-ups front. Their beliefs, their nature, how they deal with things, and more so streamlines or trickles down to the idea of powers and how they like really fundamentally simplistic and straight to the point abilities. Someone like Nobara, for example, who is a very weird choice of someone with a quote-unquote simplistic ability, but it makes me believe that if she does ever come back, they'll use this portion of time in a chapter to hinge off her ability being different. Does that make sense? Long story short, I wouldn't be surprised if they reflect on this time of the higher-ups, or Panda saying that the higher-ups think Nobara's ability is simplistic and well within their belief and image or ideal for the perfect sorcerer, for it to be entirely different, changed, morphed, advanced, or evolved because of her encounter with Mahito and surviving an ability or a soul warping technique that isn't necessarily survivable, especially in such an aggressive way that Mahito attacked her, especially critically on her face, very close to her brain. I think Panda giving the example of the abilities is only one singular facet. It may not be the most important one, but it's the one that makes a lot of sense to us, considering that is what they've been showcased to value consistently more and more. I would personally say it's more of a combination of their combining thought process on how they want the perfect sorcerer to be entirely, not just ability. And the only reason I mention it like this is because a lot of people brought up specific characters and their power being a contradiction of what the higher-ups would like. For example, Naobito, or even Gakuganji, I believe his name was. Is that his name? I honestly cannot remember. With the way Panda describes the kind of ability, simplicity, mixing it with tech is kind of like a no-no, and the higher-ups really do not like any sort of evolution of ability mixing with tech. You think of Naobito and you think of Gaku because their ability is quite literally technology. Naobito with the 24 frames per second and Gaku with the electric guitar. To be entirely honest, I don't think the higher-ups care nor have much of a say on these type of people. Not only are the mindset and the emotions that they portray is from the higher-ups era. Naobito is very abusive. He has a very specific kind of perspective towards women and is definitely not progressive in any sort of right. Exactly the same way with Gaku. We directly seen how he wanted to deal with Yuji. The last thing that I feel like the higher-ups would even care about is their abilities, not being directly in line with maybe what they would like. But even then, their abilities are super bare minimum in the sense of tech and how much more advanced it could be. 24 frames is like the minimum, especially when Naobito is introduced with his abilities. He directly mentions the newer age of technology, which is 4K 60 frames per second, which is something he does not have. So already he is the minimalistic version of it, and even the way he phrases 4K 60 and talking about it is a very within the past type of thing. Gaku's kind of in a similar sense with his guitar, and I guess when it was introduced into the world, which most likely within the mid-90s somewhere in terms of that guitar specifically, or the electric guitar, but even then I think the value comes from their mindset, it comes from their emotions, where they obviously have been born and raised, and how that has been reflected through their actions. I think with saying all of this, you could probably see why Akutami didn't bother to kind of bombard you with all of this information. I would assume this this is kind of like the big grand full picture that will most likely be brought across in any sort of given time later on. Could be the next chapter, it could be 5-10 chapters from now. It may not even be played upon ever again, but at least you got some sort of example to work with. And they used power or curse technique to streamline it all, to make it a lot more apparent and simplistic to understand, because you could just spiral the conversation down a very long length that really has no clear definition or answer unless Akutami wants to clarify. Long story short, older people that aren't necessarily progressive are going to lean towards the higher ups more so than the newer generation, Hakari, Yuji, Megumi, etc, etc. In terms of Hakari and showing off his ability and his mindset, I think it's a pretty good thing. You see him go on about a fever and him being hot or cold, gambling, wanting to make money, and everything along those lines. When it comes to his potential, I would say with Yuta reiterating that when Hakari is serious, he can get really powerful, more powerful than Yuta himself. I would say that has all to do with the fever, all to do with him feeling a certain type of way, with wanting to gamble something that is worthwhile. And maybe he doesn't get that all too often. Think of it as kind of like adrenaline, being warmed up. He's not feeling 100%. If he's not feeling warmed or heated up or ready to fight, he's going to feel cold. He's going to feel rather bored and not really into the whole thing, so he won't try as hard. So if you have something to gamble, if you have something to win and lose, it amplifies that tenfold. It makes it a very drastically different or jarring situation, which one that could be potentially life or death, especially if you are gambling that. If you take that concept with the rules of the culling games, you have a very dangerous individual. We know Hakari is already really powerful. We've had so many people reiterate his strength already. So seeing it witnessed for the first time, I don't think we're going to see anything of it until the culling games. You may see a little bit of his finesse within Yuji and his encounter, but seeing his all-out grand power, I think it's pretty obvious that it would happen most likely within the culling games, when he actually finds something worth gambling, which may be his own life, against an opponent that also wants to gamble something which may be their own life. It gets him heated or fired up, and you have a battle to be recognized. The remainder of the chapter is more so just what I've already talked about in terms of the higher-ups, but being framed around Kira. They also don't believe that Gojo actually got sealed away, and Megumi wants to convince them. He's within the mindset that if they convince Kira, they can convince Hakari. So obviously, everyone's kind of battling it out at the moment. It has yet to be shown how Panda and Megumi are going to deal with Kira and their ability, but I think the spotlight is slowly shifting, or maybe even has drastically shifted for many, to focus on Hakari and Yuji and their little scuffle at the moment, which could easily escalate and blow itself up into a full-blown encounter with Yuji getting rather serious himself. He's very level-headed within this encounter, obviously because he's trying not to give himself away, so it would be interesting to see if Hakari can push his buttons. He has the right personality to do it, and it's one of the worst things that Yuji hates becoming, someone that's fueled by pure emotion that overshadows his clarity, which makes him potentially weaker. But if he overcomes it, clears his own mind, his own thought process, he's very powerful. He's very scary, and we've seen it a handful of different times, but in terms of clarity and overcoming it, only within the Mahito fight has it been so crystal, has it been so prominent and powerful. At the moment, I am excited to see where we go from here and what type of information is going to be provided. The biggest piece that I took from this is that the higher-ups and the regulations for the sorcery world is being revised. This could quite literally change everything. It could make things 100 times worse, or it could make things a tiny little bit better. But knowing how the story is going, with how the culling games is being built up, I would say the revised rules or regulations is going to make what Yuji and everyone else is doing regarding Gojo, as well as Maki and the situation with the Zenin family, 10 times, if not 100 times worse. I wouldn't be surprised if they put Maki on some international most wanted list at this point. Mind you, they were already all wanted and would be easily executed because they're trying to help Gojo, but Maki has definitely taken it a step above with the annihilation of a whole clan. So it would be very interesting to see how the higher-ups would even try to approach that. Sure, sure they can make many rules, but how do they enforce those rules? They called upon Yuta to try and get Yuji. Look how that turned out. So do they have anyone else up their sleeves, or are they just waiting for someone to help them? They seem very underpowered and under-supported at the moment, so maybe something has to change. I guess all we can do now is wait. So with that being said, that is basically it. I would love to hear your thoughts on Hakari, this chapter in general, the higher ups, Kira, pretty much this whole situation in general. There's a lot of things going around, a lot of ways this could honestly change the core of Jujutsu Kaisen, with the regulations being rewritten and the Jujutsu or sorcery world being changed specifically, but also the culling games. We're right around the corner from it, and that in itself, power is going to shift and create a whole different thing. I would love to hear your thoughts. With all of that, I want to thank you all for watching. Leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed. I greatly appreciate it. Drink plenty of water. New video every 3 days, and I will see you within the next one. Goodbye.